Well, good morning. It's good to be with you today, and I'm Katie Bliss. I get the privilege of working with our kids here at Hope, which is an amazing thing. Trust me, you want to be a part of that. And I'm just privileged to be able to step in for Clay today as he is on vacation. Everybody needs a vacation once in a while, so we're allowing him to go ahead and do that. Well, I'm excited to be with you today, and I have been thinking a little bit about those moments in time where we get really excited about something that we're saving our money for, or think about when you're a kid and you can't wait for Christmas because you're looking for that very, very special gift. You're waiting, you can't wait. Here's some ideas. I don't know, I figured the grill, big fancy one. We have 4th of July coming up, right? Phones, fancy dresses you wear once. I mean, come on. I can tell you for sure when it comes to tennis shoes, but there's been one or two pairs at least that I've had a little buyer's remorse when I was done. So we get to go ahead now and find out what it will be like to get what we ask for, or at least to get what Israel asked for. Last week, I want to just give us a little bit of a reminder of where we've been. Clay shared with us from chapter 8 that sometimes God lets us have what we ask for, not because it's good, but so that we will see that it's bad and turn back to what is good. You see, last week the nation of Israel said, we want a king, and that wasn't necessarily a bad thing, but they said, we want a king like all the other nations. Okay, there's your bad thing. They have God. They don't need a king like all the other nations. They have the greatest king of all, the same king that you and I have now. So, where are we headed? We're going to find out just how that works out for Israel. It's going to have some good, it's going to have some bad. So we'll start in Samuel chapter 9. There was a Benjamite, a man of standing, whose name was Kish, son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Bechorath, and the son of Aphiah of Benjamin. Kish had a son named Saul, as handsome a young man as could be found anywhere in Israel, and he was a head taller than anyone else. Now, the first verse basically just tells us Saul is a nobody in Israel. He's pretty low on the pecking order, so to speak. But then it goes on to tell us that he was pretty good to look at, and he looked impressive. He was a head taller than everyone else. This sounds like a good thing, I think. We've been introduced to a new character. We'll see how that plays out for them. Now, one interesting thing about Saul's name is it means asked for. Well, this might mean something. We have a new character, and last week they asked for a king. Perhaps there's something about all of this. He has been sent out next to look for missing donkeys for his dad. Now, let me tell you just a little bit before we dive into that of where we're going this morning. And that is, we have 6 chapters to cover, so buckle in, we're going for a ride. And no, we are not going to cover every single verse because we would be here until at least 3, and I don't think you want to do that. So we are going to be listening to a little bit of some paraphrase version of Katie's as we go along so that we can catch you up in the story as we get to some points that need to be emphasized. So Saul has been sent out by his dad to go find these missing donkeys. In this process, he has a servant with him, and they're looking and they're looking. In fact, they get to the point where he finally says, okay, I don't think we're going to find these donkeys. Maybe we should go home because I think Dad's going to get worried about me. And so he decides that's what we're going to do, but then his servant says, wait. We're really close to a town here, and I happen to know that the man of God is here. And he's referring then to Samuel, who is the prophet of the time. So why don't we go and see him? So I was like, nah, I don't think that's a good idea. We don't have anything to give him. I don't think we should do that. So he's kind of hesitant. So there's a couple of things to note about Saul at this moment. For one, he does eventually do what the servant says. So he's following his servant. But 2, Saul gives up on the task at hand. He's ready to abandon those donkeys. And he's hesitant to involve God. Those are 2 significant things, because we're going to find in the next few chapters that he's going to be hesitant to involve God more than once. Let's take a look at verse 15. All right. Now, the day before Saul came, the Lord had revealed this to Samuel. About this time tomorrow, I will send you a man from the land of Benjamin. Anoint him ruler over my people Israel. He will deliver them from the hand of the Philistines. I have looked on my people, for their cry has reached me. When Samuel caught sight of Saul, the Lord said to him, "This is the man I spoke to you about. He will govern my people." Saul approached Samuel in the gateway and asked, "Would you please tell me where the seer's house is?" "I am the seer," Samuel replied. "Go up ahead of me to the high place, for today you are to eat with me, and in the morning I will send you on your way, and will tell you all that is in your heart. As for the donkeys you lost 3 days ago, do not worry about them. They have been found. And to whom all the desire of Israel turned, if not to you and your whole family line?" Saul answered, "But am I not a Benjamite from the smallest tribe of Israel? And is not my clan the least of all the clans of the tribe of Benjamin? Why do you say such a thing to me?" All right, a couple things to note. Saul doesn't recognize the man of God. So either he hasn't really been paying attention to what's going on in Israel, or he just doesn't care. We don't really know. As we're going to go through this, we're going to note that the author of 1 Samuel doesn't really give us any insight into what Saul is thinking along the way. But he certainly doesn't recognize him. And then, once again, he's hesitant to believe. He's like, wait, whoa. Do you know who I am? I'm like from Nowheresville. Why would you say those things to me? Yet, here's the man of God telling him all the things he wants to know, and he still is hesitant to believe this is truth. Verse 27, Samuel said to Saul, "Tell the servant to go on ahead of us." The servant did so. "But you stay here for a while, so that I may give you a message from God." Then Samuel took a flask of olive oil and poured it on Saul's head and kissed him, saying, "Has not the Lord anointed you ruler over his inheritance? When you leave me today, you will meet 2 men near Rachel's tomb at Zelzah on the border of Benjamin. They will say to you, 'The donkeys you set out to look for have been found, and now your father has stopped thinking about them and is worried about you. He is asking, what shall I do about my son?' Then you will go from there until you reach the great tree of Tabor. 3 men going up to worship God at Bethel will meet you there. One will be carrying 3 young goats, another 3 loaves of bread, and another a skin of wine. They will greet you and offer you 2 loaves of bread, which you will accept from them. After that, you will go to Gibeah of God, where there is a Philistine outpost. As you approach the town, you will meet a procession of prophets coming down from the high place with lyres, timbrels, pipes, and harps being played before them, and they will be prophesying. The Spirit of the Lord will come powerfully upon you, and you will prophesy with them, and you will be changed into a different person. Once these signs are fulfilled, do whatever your hand finds to do, for God is with you. So go down ahead of me to Gilgal. I will surely come down to you to sacrifice burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, but you must wait 7 days until I come to you and tell you what you are to do." All right, in some different translations, the word ruler is actually translated as prince. So it's kind of fascinating that even in this time where Samuel is anointing him the new king, he's not actually using the word king. I think part of that is probably because Samuel recognizes who the true king really is. However, in this, you see how God is so good and so gracious. Israel has rejected him as their king, and yet he still calls them his inheritance. He still calls them mine. Despite the fact that they're ready to toss him aside, he's claiming them as his own. That's pretty amazing grace. He then gives Saul all these signs. These things are going to happen to you. And when they do, you'll know that my word is true. They do happen. Every single one of them happen. And God's word can be trusted to be true. Then Samuel tells Saul a few things he's supposed to do. He's supposed to actually act on this information. One thing that's pretty amazing for Saul is that God's going to empower him. He's literally going to change him from the very person he was into someone else. That's pretty awesome. I think those of us who've trusted in Jesus have experienced the same thing, where we've literally been changed into someone else and hopefully continually being changed. Well, this is going to happen to Saul. He's going to be empowered by the Spirit. And when that is done, Samuel gives Saul two things to do. First, he's to do whatever his hand finds to do, the text says, which they would have recognized as being kind of a military action thing, to do whatever your hand finds to do. So, just a few chapters earlier, we noticed that God said he'd heard his people and that he heard them crying out against the oppression of the Philistines, and now he's being told to do something military-wise. So he's got those two instructions. One, attack the Philistines. That's your military thing. And two, then go to Gilgal and wait 7 days for Samuel, who's going to make some sacrifices and then let you know what you get to do that God says next. So he's given two instructions. Notice in this timing, Saul is still under Samuel. Who's giving the instructions? God's prophet. And who's giving the prophet the words? God. They're trying to push him aside, but they're not having very good luck. They're still noticing that God is still king. And that's a really good thing. Let's look at verse 14. Now, Saul's uncle, so Saul has now come back, he's back home, asked him and his servant, "Where have you been?" "Looking for the donkeys," he said. "But when we saw they were not to be found, we went to Samuel." Now Saul's uncle said, "Tell me what Samuel said to you." Saul replied, "He assured us that the donkeys had been found." But he did not tell his uncle what Samuel had said about the kingship. What? You've just been told you're going to be king over an entire nation, you're going to rule an entire nation, and you don't tell anybody? That seems kind of weird. When good things happen to us, or at least amazing things, even if they're somewhat bad, we tend to tell people. That's what you do. But he decides to hide it. We don't know why. Why is he hiding this information? What are his motives? Could it be that he's afraid? Maybe. Could it be that he might believe it's not true? Possibly, although that seems a little far-fetched, or Saul's a little slow, because remember those signs Samuel gave him? All of those things happen. So why wouldn't he also end up being ruler over Israel? Seems like a logical conclusion, but Saul isn't telling anyone. Okay. Then Samuel summons everyone back, all of Israel, just like they had all been together in chapter 8. They're now going to all come back. And he reminds all of the nation what God's done for them. That he has delivered them from Egypt, that he's always been their rescuer, that he always will be their rescuer. And what do? You rejected him. And he tells it straightforward to them. You rejected him. Then he decides to take them tribe by tribe, clan by clan, all the way down to one person. Now you have to understand, as the nation of Israel, that is something that's going to put a little fear in your heart. Because the last time they went tribe by tribe, clan by clan, all the way down to one person, somebody died. Because they had sinned against God. All right, well, that gives us a little bit of context, because when they get all the way down to that one person who happens to be Saul, where is he? He's hiding. Okay, he didn't tell his uncle, and now he's hiding. Well, okay, perhaps I'll give him the benefit of the doubt and assume that's because he's thinking, oh, great, I'm toast. Possible. But he's hiding. They can't find him. They're thinking, what's going on? But then he comes out because God tells him where he's at. And this is what happens. Samuel said to all the people, "Do you see the man the Lord has chosen? There is no one like him among all the people." Then the people shouted, "Long live the king." Samuel explained to the people the rights and duties of kingship. He wrote them down on a scroll and deposited it before the Lord. Then Samuel dismissed the people to go to their own homes. Now, they've already said, okay, he's our king, this must be the guy. But then Samuel gives him the specifics of what a king can do. Most likely that was Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 through 20, where back in the law, Moses told them, when you have a king, he needs to do X, Y, Z. And all of them had to do with reminding him who really has the power, and that was God. So some of it was little things like you don't need horses, you don't need chariots, because, well, who's going to fight your battles? God's going to fight your battles. Then the king was to read all of these things regularly. He was to never forget that he really wasn't in charge, but that God was in charge. That's likely what Samuel put on that scroll. It's also possible that he reminded the people at that time, back in chapter 8, remember all those things he told the people that the king would take from them, take, like Clay said last week. He may have reminded them of that as well. So here, they've told him, he's given him, here's your king. It kind of sounded like a punishment. Perhaps it may be. We'll see how that all unfolds. The issue here, again, is Israel wanted a king like all the other nations. But, as we see, they got a king who's going to have to submit to the prophet and ultimately to God. That's actually a good thing. If he can do this, we're going to be set. Well, then the next thing that happens is the Israel is threatened by Nahash, who's an Ammonite, and he's going to take them out. He's gone to the town of Jabesh Gilead, and he's like, all right, you're going to be my servants, and this is how it's going to go down. They say, okay, can we just like barter with you? Can we make a treaty and somehow wriggle out of this? He's like, no way. Well, sure, I'll let you do that, but first you're going to have to gouge out your right eye. No big deal. They kind of freak out about that, of course, and they say, just give us a few days to see if anybody will come and help us out and maybe not let this happen, anyone from Israel. Well, now they're all in a panic. They're sending out all these people to tell the entire nation, this is what's going on, you got to help us, this is not going well. But the funny thing is okay, Saul has just been declared king. Nobody tells Saul. Well, what I didn't tell you is that after Saul was declared king, it also mentioned a few people they call scoundrels who didn't think he should be king. So perhaps that was more than a few. Perhaps there was a few people in Israel who were thinking, yeah, this isn't going to work out. I don't want this guy. I don't know. But they didn't think to tell Saul, which seems a little bit strange. So Saul finally hears about it, and then he is stirred to action, which is, I love this part, because when Saul hears their words, the Spirit of God comes powerfully upon him, and he burned with anger. He's finally going to act. But the thing is why is he going to act? He's going to act because God's the one who puts this in his heart to do something about it. God's the one who's going to get him to finally act like a king and to move forward. So then what does he do? He takes an ox, he cuts it up into little pieces and sends it to all of the tribes of Israel and says, you need to come out and stand with me or this is going to happen to you. Well, that's pretty graphic. And a reminder, once again, for Israel, that happened once before where something was cut up and sent around to Israel, and this is going to happen to you unless you fight with me. So he was sending a pretty serious message. So they do, because that was scary. And so they go ahead and they fight the battle, and God wins the battle. And this is what Saul says. After the battle, they're ready to take care of these people who said, we don't want you as our king. And Saul says, no. No one will be put to death today, for this day the Lord has rescued Israel. Yay! Saul does something right. This is fabulous. Maybe this king thing's not going to be so bad after all. He's pointing to God as the one who saves them. This is good. This is how the king is supposed to be in Israel. Nice job, Saul. Then we move on. And Samuel says to the people, okay, now we're going to go, let's go to Gilgal, and there renew the kingship. So I'm assuming that's all because, some people didn't really believe he was going to be the king, and now things have happened. Let's change that. So all the people went to Gilgal and made Saul king in the presence of the Lord. There they sacrificed fellowship offerings before the Lord, and Saul and all the Israelites held a great celebration. They're having these fellowship offerings. This is good. This is a heart of a people that is gradually returning to God. We will see them fully return for at least a moment in just a little bit. So they have a human king, and they aren't rejecting fully their heavenly king. Progress. They're all at Gilgal, and they're slowly returning. Then, chapter 12, Samuel says, all right, my work seems to be done here. God said, give you a king, here's your king. So Samuel addresses them. It says his final address, is he's kind of just saying, all right, here's the old order was me as your prophet. The new order, all right, you got your king. Here's what's going to happen. Now, In doing that, Samuel then says to them, have I ever wronged you? Have I ever taken things from you? Have I ever done any of this? So he's basically asking them to tell him about that. And they say, no, you've been great. You've done a good job. And then he tells them about what a bad job they've done. So then he tells them how, once again, reminding them of where they've been, that they were in Egypt, that God rescued them, that he's always fought their battles, that he's always taken care of them, that he's always been their ultimate king, and that they have rejected him and not wanted him as their king. They want a king like all the other nations. This is bad. They're starting to recognize that. And to emphasize his point, Samuel then asks God to send rain during a time where there shouldn't be rain. And the people are starting to shake in their boots a little bit. Verse 13, chapter 12. Now here is the king you have chosen, the one you have asked for. See, the Lord has set a king over you. If you fear the Lord and serve and obey him and do not rebel against his commands, and if both you and the king who reigns over you follows the Lord your God, good. But if you do not obey the Lord, and if you rebel against his commands, his hand will be against you, as it was against your ancestors. That's the warning he gives them, and then it rains. And then they panic just a little bit. And they ask Samuel, please pray to your God. That's key. They still haven't claimed him fully. Pray to your God, not our God, your God. Samuel says, of course I'm going to pray for you. I'm not going to not teach you. I'm not going to stop praying for you, even though you have rejected God as king. But you've got to obey God, and your king must obey God as well, if it's to go well with you. So they're returning, yet fearfully. Verse 19. The people all said to Samuel, pray to the Lord your God for your servants, so that we will not die. For we have added to all our other sins the evil of asking for a king. Do not be afraid, Samuel replied. You have done all of this evil, yet do not turn away from the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart. Do not turn away after useless idols. They can do you no good, nor can they rescue you, because they are useless. For the sake of his great name, the Lord will not reject his people, because the Lord was pleased to make you his own. As for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by failing to pray for you, and I will teach you the way that is good and right. But be sure to fear the Lord and serve him faithfully with all your heart. Consider what great things he has done for you. Yet, if you persist in doing evil, both you and your king will perish. God's grace is still all over that. I will claim you as mine for my great name, God says. His name is great and worthy of praise, and Samuel's reminding them of where they should be and how to stay good with God and how to stay submissive to him. Let me move on to chapter 13, and we're going to start out here with the reign of a king. This is the first of the accounts of the reigning of the king, and when we start out at the very beginning, it tells you how long, how old he was, and then when we end in the end of chapter 14, we end up with a who's who's list and all the military things he's done. This is a pattern. I've been reading through Kings right now, and every time you come to a new king, it tells you, okay, he reigned for such and such an amount of time. At the end, this is what happened, and he's done. So they're now giving us that same kind of account of Samuel, but interestingly, only in just a couple chapters. I'll share with you in a moment why I think that is. So, chapter 13 starts out, here he is, this is your king, he's going to reign for this amount of time. And then we hear about his son. Verse 3, Jonathan attacked the Philistine outpost at Geba, and the Philistines heard about it. Then Saul had the trumpet blown throughout the land and said, let the Hebrews hear. So all Israel heard the news. Saul has attacked the Philistine outpost, and now Israel has become obnoxious to the Philistines. And the people were summoned to join Saul at Gilgal. Okay, think back to the steps of action that Samuel gave Saul. 1, attack the Philistines. Well, he didn't really do that, but his son did. Close enough, we'll take that as good. 2, go to Gilgal and wait. hey, they're in Gilgal. So it's starting to happen. This is good, but go and wait. Then he waited 7 days, verse 8, the time set by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and Saul's men began to scatter. So he said, bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings. And Saul offered up the burnt offering. Just as he finished making the offering, Samuel arrived, and Saul went out to greet him. Okay. Philistine army. Big one. In fact, verse 5 tells us that there's 6,000 charioteers, soldiers as numerous as the sand on the seashore, and they're all waiting for you at Michmash. And now Saul's in Gilgal, and his army is starting to scatter. And he's thinking, oh dear, what am I going to do? I have no army. They're falling apart. We need to get this show on the road. He finally makes a decisive action as king, and he's like, all right, fine, we're just going to take care of this burnt offering thing. You're thinking, he's making decisive action. That's probably good, right? Maybe not. Just as he finished making the offering, of course, just as he finishes, Samuel shows up. And I'm thinking that at this point, I picture Saul running out to Samuel. Oh, good, you're finally here. Guess what happened? And Samuel responds with, what have you done? I can't help but hear my mom in that voice. What have you done? And I'm like, that's never a good question. And Saul comes back with, well, when I saw that the men were scattering and that you did not come at the set time and the Philistines were assembling at Michmash, and excuses, I thought, well, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the Lord's favor, so I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering, I like to add, for you. That was good, right? I did a good thing. No. Then Samuel says, you have done a foolish thing. You have not kept the commands the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command. Okay. His army's scattering. He's panicking. I think I'm reminded at this point that obeying God requires trust. It requires trust even against all instincts. We can't help but feel sympathetic for Saul a little bit at this point. I mean, his army is running away. I can understand why he felt like he needed to do something. It wasn't the right something, but I can see why he felt compelled to do something. But we can trust God even when it looks like there's no hope. And that is the kind of trust that God requires from us. Samuel tells him he's a fool. And he tells him, that's it, your kingdom is done. Remember how we started at the very beginning with how long Saul's going to rule, and we're going to end at the end of chapter 14 with the fact that these are the things that he's done. Well, that's only about 2 years. Saul acts as human king for at least another 40 years. But I think what they're sandwiching here is how Saul was king following God, and now it's done. You blew it. Yeah, you can still be there being human king, but it's not gonna go well with you. God's not gonna be with you. 2 years. That's it. God's going to look for a man after his own heart, because the only king to rule God's people is a king who's obedient to God. Saul was a king chosen for themselves. God gives them what they wanted. A king to lead them in battle. He's doing that. Saul's response here, the way he responds to Samuel, I mentioned a lot of excuses. Well, just a week ago, I was at EFCA 1 with some of the pastoral staff, and I sat in on one of Fritz Dale's his sessions, and he talked a little bit about how we manage our sin and how sometimes we feel, or we manage it in a way where we're kind of damaged over our sin. We feel sorry for it, but we're not broken over our sin. Well, when I looked at that chart, all I could think of, because of course I was already studying this, was Saul. And I look at that list on the left of being damaged over our sin and look at some of the things where he's negotiating, he's strategizing, that's all the things he was doing. He was strategizing to, what am I going to do? I got an army to fight. He's striving. He's trying to figure out how to do it on his own. He's being self-reliant, and he's arrogant, and he's blaming others. Well, if you had been on time, Samuel, none of this would have happened. Okay, that's the Katie paraphrase version if you were wondering. But I'm thinking, that's what he was thinking. Where were you? I thought you were going to be here. But note the right column. He doesn't repent. None of his words are repentant. He's not surrendered. He's not resting in God by any means. He's definitely not trusting him. He's definitely not humble. I show us this chart because I think, how often do we struggle with the same things in managing our own sin? How often do I fall in column on the right or left when I should be on the right? Sorry, it's backwards for me. All right. It happens a lot, and there's a big difference between those two columns. At this point, I want to share a quote with you from a theologian, John Woodhouse, who I think summarizes really well what's going on in the lives of Israel. He says, however, we must now grasp something that is difficult for us to see. The really fearful situation for Saul and the Israelites wasn't the Philistines. It was the Lord God who had made it clear through his prophet that what he required of his people and their king was obedience. We find this hard to see because we are so like Saul. We sympathize with him because we too find that to obey God fully, to trust God fully, really is beyond us in the circumstances in which we find ourselves. You see, the only way that we can fully trust God and we can fully obey is through Jesus. We're just stinking bad at it by ourselves. At least I know I am. Without Jesus' power and his changing work in my heart, I'm not very good at trusting. I'm not very good at obeying. But because I know what God's done through Christ on the cross, I can trust. I can obey. And it's all through his power and through his strength. Saul, I think, was destined to fail because he didn't trust God from the very beginning. He questioned Samuel from the very beginning. He didn't trust him, and he didn't obey. Now, chapter 14, for the most part, shows us a contrast between Saul and his son Jonathan. So we're going to take just a little bit of a look at this battle and see how things are a bit different. Verse 1, one day Jonathan, son of Saul, said to his young armor bearer, "Come, let's go over to the Philistine outpost on the other side," but he did not tell his father. That's curious. I think it means something about their relationship and perhaps about their differences. Let's take a look at verse 6, which happens to be one of my favorites in this whole passage. Jonathan then says to his young armor bearer once again, "Come, let's go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised men. Perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few." Nothing can keep the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. How different that is from Saul's response. His army starts to scatter. He still has quite a few men, but they start to scatter and he panics. Jonathan's like, "Okay, armor bearer, you and me, let's go get the Philistines. Because we can if this is God's will." There's a very big contrast between how Jonathan trusts and how Saul does not. The armor bearer says, "Do all that you have in mind. Go ahead. I am with you, heart and soul." Jonathan said, "Come on then. We will cross over toward them and let them see us. If they say to us, 'Wait there until we come to you,' we will stay where we are and not go up to them. But if they say, 'Come up to us,' we will climb up, because that will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands." So both of them showed themselves to the Philistines' outpost. "Look," said the Philistines, "the Hebrews are crawling out of the holes they were hiding in." The men of the outpost shout to Jonathan and his armor bearer, "Come up to us, and we will teach you a lesson." So Jonathan said to his armor bearer, "Climb up after me. The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel." Jonathan climbed up, using his hands and feet, with his armor bearer right behind him. The Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer followed and killed behind him. In the first attack, Jonathan and his armor bearer killed about 20 men in the area of about half an acre. Wow. That's kind of crazy. Yet Jonathan is demonstrating that he knows where the infinite power belongs. It belongs to God. And he submits then to God's will. Then as you continue on, and we'll summarize this, God is clearly working for them. Because after that, the Philistines go into a complete panic. They don't know what they're doing. They're panicking. They're actually killing each other with swords. And the text goes on to tell us it's because God is working for them that day. God saved. That's what's happening. God saved them that day. The chapter starts concluding then with a strange oath that Saul decides to put the men under. Verse 24. The Israelites were in distress that day because Saul had bound the people under an oath, saying, "Cursed be anyone who eats food before evening comes, because I have avenged myself on my enemies. Before I have avenged myself on my enemies." So none of the troops tasted food. Now, I've run a few long-distance runs before, and to go out without fuel is a really stupid idea. You are not going to make it. That is what I think of when I read this oath. Why on earth would he do this? We really don't know. He doesn't tell us, but again, it does say, "Before I have avenged myself on my enemies." All I can figure here is it's a self-focus. He wants control. He's going to make sure he has it, and he takes care of it through this very bizarre oath, which does not end well for them. Jonathan didn't know about it because he was already over taking care of Philistines. So here we go. We've got this oath going on. Things are kind of weird. They're chasing Philistines. In fact, he gets all excited now. They figure out when the Philistines are all going crazy and they see them from afar that someone has obviously taken on the Philistines. Let's figure this out. There's a bunch of chaos in the Israelite camp, but eventually they join the battle and they're chasing Philistines. And in that moment, they do enter into a forest where there's honey and there's food. Well, Jonathan doesn't know about the oath. He tastes some of that honey, and then they tell him, "Oh, by the way, your dad told us we can't do that." And he's like, "Well, that was dumb. Just look at how much better I feel after having a little bit of food. Think about how many more Philistines we could have taken this day." That's his response. And they continue on with the battle. They end up stopping at some point, and then we get to verse 33, where here's what's happening. Okay, they are done. They're done fighting, and they're really hungry. They're so hungry that this oath ends up leading the entire army to sin, because they decide we're just going to kill animals and eat them right now. Well, we know from the law that first of all, it's not very healthy. Second of all, we also know from the law that that's bad, that you're not supposed to do that with the lifeblood in them. So then someone comes to Saul and says, "Look, the men are sinning against the Lord by eating meat that has blood in it." Interesting that someone else has to point that out to Saul. His eyes are not on God. Someone else points that out. At least, you got to give Saul credit. He does something about it, and he tells them to stop. So that's good. Saul's telling them to stop, but his eyes aren't there. Then we're going to take a look at verse 36. Saul decides we're going to chase them some more. "Let us go down and pursue the Philistines by night and plunder them till dawn, and let us not leave one of them alive." "Do whatever seems best to you," they replied. But the priest said, "Let us inquire of God here." Once again, someone else is reminding Saul to look to God. He didn't think to do that on his own. Someone had to tell him to do it. Again, Saul is not trusting God. So they ask. God doesn't say anything. Saul assumes it's because somebody has sinned. And so he's going to figure that one out. And he says in verse 39, "As surely as the Lord who rescues Israel lives, even if the guilt lies with my son Jonathan, he must die." And this is kind of the kicker here. But not one of them said a word. No one's going to rat out Jonathan. It's not what they see what's going on, and they're not going to tell him a word. So then they figure it all out. Yep, it's Jonathan. He confesses that I ate some honey, and we get to verse 45. But the men said to Saul, "Should Jonathan die, he who has brought about this great deliverance in Israel? Never! As surely as the Lord lives, not a hair on his head will fall to the ground, for he did this today with God's help." So the men rescued Jonathan, and he was not put to death. See, they recognized that Jonathan was following God and that he couldn't have done anything that he did that day without God working for him. Saul didn't recognize that, but the people did. Then the chapter wraps up with Saul's military accomplishments and his who's who list in his family, that pattern again of a king in the end of his reign. Then I want to point out verse 52 real quick, the last verse of the chapter. All the days of Saul there was bitter war with the Philistines, and whenever Saul saw a mighty or brave man, he took him into his service. I think that's important because back in chapter 8, remember how Clay told us that the king was going to take? Well, here it goes. That's exactly what he's doing. He's taking people into his service, and he's taking what he wants. Israel gets what they wanted. They get a king who will go before them in battle. And they get what Samuel said they would get to. A king who's going to take and take. Now I think too, there are things from Saul's life that apply to us, not just how he handled his sin, but from the very beginning, Saul is hiding. Now, I think it's kind of a funny thing that we even try to do this, but I sometimes try to hide my sin from God. How brilliant is that? He already knows. And yet, I do. And yet, there's also times where I try to hide from him, too. I don't really want to, no, Lord, I hear you telling me I should do that, but I don't think I'm ready. That's not going to work very well. So I'm going to ask all of us to think about, what is it that you are trying to hide from God? Or where are you trying to hide from God? And consider confessing that today as you spend time reflecting on Saul's life. Saul had a failure to wait on God. Now I know lots of times in my life where I'd like to take things in my own hands and not wait on God because he's just taking too long. Where is it in your life that you're struggling to wait on God? He's there. He'll come. The timing will be perfect. I can guarantee that. But can we trust him enough to wait? And finally, there are areas in our lives, there's areas in my life where sometimes I'm not trusting God, where sometimes I'm not being obedient. So I ask you the same question I ask of myself. Where do you need more trust? Where do you need to obey? What is he calling to you that you've been saying no when you need to say yes? Perhaps this is a time where you need to repent and turn back to God. I recognize that he is the one true king. See, as we look at Saul's failures, hopefully one thing is true. Saul's failure to trust and obey should point us to the true king, the obedient king, Jesus, the king who makes it possible for us to fully trust and fully obey God. Let's pray. Dearest Lord Jesus, please help us to trust you. Help us to obey you with all that we have. Father God, give us your strength to rest, to be still, to be willing to wait, to be willing to trust even when it's hard. Open our eyes to areas that we need to confess and that we need to give to you. And give us the strength to walk forward with obedience. In your name I pray.